Uh, Very good evening, a very good afternoon, and very good morning to all our panelists and chair from United States, Europe, and Asia. We start with our fourth session of our two-day international webinar celebrating 75 years of Indian foreign policy. The theme of the session is Indian foreign policy, perspectives from various geographies. The session will be chaired by Dr. C. Raja Mohan, Senior Fellow, Asia Society Policy Institute, New Delhi. And our distinguished panelists include Dr. Yeon-jung from Seoul. She is a research professor, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Seoul, South Korea. Our second speaker is Professor Nicolas Blarel, Associate Professor of International Relations at the Institute of Political Science, Leiden University, the Netherlands. We'll be shortly joined by we have also Professor Amrita Narlikar, President, German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, Germany. And we'll be shortly joined by Dr. Mr. Michael Kugelman from Wilson Center, Washington. So I'll hand over the proceedings to the chair. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. It's wonderful to welcome you all for this session. This is, I think, quite a unique session in this whole seminar. It is taking an outside look into India's foreign policy. As a nation, as a collective, like all large nations, India tends to be self-referential. We're consumed by our own debates. It's not often that we hear what others think of us. What others think of us might not necessarily correspond with what we think of ourselves. So I think it's a good reality check to have a outside look into the Indian foreign policy. And to do that, we have a wonderful panel here. Dr. Chi from Hankuk University, Nicolas and Amrita from Europe, and Michael, if he joins us, he'll be from Washington. So what I thought I'll do is I hope it's agreeable to the panelists. If you all can speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, that will take us into 40 minutes, and then we have about at least 15, 20 minutes left for a discussion and question answers. I hope that is agreeable to all of you. So let's start off with Dr. Chi. Dr. Chi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for having me here. And I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to ICWA. So before I get started, I'd like to share my slide.
Can you speak up a bit? I mean, it's.
Am I audible?
Little. Can you make it a little louder? I mean...
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. And can you see my slide, please? Is my slides on the screen? Yes.
Okay. Yes, your slides are visible.
Okay, thank you. So the topic I'd like to discuss today is about how China, Japan, South Korea perceives India's foreign policy in transition and India's rise, and how these countries started to build different strategies toward India. So in fact, India's rise has been much discussed so far for last at least 2 to 3 decades, and many discuss enough how India's rise has been peaceful and cordial to international order, unlike China's. But many still argue about how India's rise and foreign policy in transition will impact on the Indo-Pacific region, and how these changes will meet their national interest. So China, Japan, South Korea pays more attention to this topic because they were the key countries in the Asia-Pacific region in the past, and now all three countries want to be more powerful player in the Pacific region, and they wish not to be isolated in the new geographical platform. So this summary shows the three countries' current understanding on India, and clearly their understandings are varied. Unlike South Korea and Japan, China perceives India's rise is slower than its rise, and India makes a gradual development. On the other hand, South Korea and Japan generally understand that India's rise is much noticeable for the last 10 years. So one common understanding among these countries has been India poses no or limited military threat despite the New Delhi's advanced military technologies. So second point is that regarding the India's role in the Indo-Pacific region in the future, the three countries again understand differently. So first, China perceives India's role in the Indo-Pacific region is still limited, and India plays out as a second-tier player. Many Chinese scholars and analysts argue that India's leading role is not seen much, and India's expanding engagement led by other countries like US keep India being not a top-level player. In opposition, Japan sees India as a leading player in this region, and Tokyo generally trusts India can be a multi-level collaborator while some issues should be sorted out more. In comparison to Japan, South Korea keeps its stance to understand India as an independent key player in this Indo-Pacific region. And South Korea's policymakers and scholars are much focused on what alternative agendas, India can suggest, and what South Korea can collaborate more. So based on the different understanding on India's role in transition in the Indo-Pacific region, the domestic demands to cooperate with India from these three countries are also varied. So to sum up that the Beijing's understanding on India's rise is very slower, and India remains as a medium-level player. So Beijing still do not need to consider India as a top policy priority. So in result, Beijing is determined still to follow the medium-level risk management strategy toward India. In other words, China desires to keep India in its second-tier conversational channel on demand, and Beijing is self-confident that it can balance the pressure toward India. So for last 10 years or to 15 years, China gradually developed issue-based unilateralism, and China wants India to join its move to the limited extent. For instance, China wants to be a leading player to share the information on Afghanistan and Ukraine war to the limited extent. But China often sees India as a valuable leveraging factor to garner its support from its friendly countries in South Asia. So in Beijing's understanding that India's presence is somewhat helpful to forge a strategic partnership with other South Asian countries. So China is determined to its approach toward India as a pragmatism, as per its perception. And now many Chinese scholars started to see China's strategic alignment overweights India's multi-alignment. And it is also interesting to see how Japan understands India. So Japan's latest development toward India is like India rises rapidly, and India is very much potential to be a key collaborator to Japan's foreign policy in transition. So Japan generally puts India in its policy priority. So Japan's such move is based on the Tokyo's military ambition to counter China in the future. So the recent discussions with India includes India-Japan military cooperation, as reported about the first joint fighter jet drill a few days ago. And another point noticeable is Japan expects a lot on its trilateral dialogue platform with India. So Japan succeeded so far to collaborate with India to invite a lot of countries, including the Australia, Italy, EU, US, France, in Japan-India-led trilateral dialogues. So through this diplomatic platform, Japan expects India to be an all-weather friend in its global ambition. The last player is observer is South Korea. So South Korea's understanding on India's recent development is also distinctive. Seoul sees India rises rapidly and has been a key player in the Pacific region. But the South Korea's observation is more focused on India's strategic autonomy in this region. And Seoul expects to make a closer tie with India within a mutual understanding that their strategic autonomy is preserved. So Seoul wants to discuss all possible issues with India beyond its economic cooperation. And some of the attempts Seoul made through the new Southern policy under the previous government or the President Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy that was lately announced proves Seoul's goodwill. Moreover, South Korea sees India is an ideal partner to discuss the joint capacity building that should be beyond the geopolitical pressure. So it is quite unambiguous that the three major players in East Asia understand and expect differently from India. While all these countries have some prospects and expectations, let me conclude that some of the leftover issues these countries worry about. So in China, what policymakers and scholars worry about domestically is how to keep India engaged with China. So while Beijing sees India being not a top-tier player, it doesn't mean that India doesn't have a balancing power against China. So from China's perspective, India becoming more confident and stricter toward China challenges its power and pressure level toward India. However, Beijing wants India to come to the conversation and dialogues on mutually agreed issues. In case of Japan, Tokyo worries about the extent of India's strategic autonomy that will be played in its bilateral and trilateral engagement with in the future. Still, Japan's foreign policy is in development within the U.S. alliance system, and its policy priority cannot be altered in any time soon. So while Japan is speedily becoming closer to India in all levels, but some Japanese scholars are still becoming a little bit cautious about what this bilateral development will harvest ultimately. And besides, while Japan is in many diplomatic disputes with China, still Tokyo sees closer Japan-China ties in many fields that includes economic ties. So how Japan will handle when the interest of the China-Japan ties clashes with the India-Japan ties. And in case of South Korea, Seoul explores if South Korea and India can forge a solid and mutual strategic objectives. So one of the South Korea's policy priority lies on the potential unification with North Korea in the future. And this issue entangles with the China and US engagement in Korean Peninsula. So due to the heavy weight of this issue, the Seoul still seeks to cooperate in science and technology and defense technology cooperation. However, the Seoul worries about if Seoul's policy priority disturbs the India-Korea strategic ties. So here I hope to wrap up my presentation and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. G, for that very sharp and concise presentation. You really stuck to your 10 minutes. So now let me, before I proceed to the next panelist, let me just welcome Michael Kugelman, who's joined us in the last few minutes. Michael, we've agreed that everyone will speak for about 10 minutes. That should give us about 20 odd minutes for question and answers. May I now turn to Nicolas. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Dr. Rajamohan, and thank you to ISA for having me today. I'm happy to participate in this
Can you increase
this
the
conference.
volume? Can you speak up? Increase your volume. Yeah.
Sure. Let's see. Is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you again for inviting me to ISA, for inviting me for this the webinar. I'm based, as Dr. Rajamohan mentioned, I'm based in Leiden in the Netherlands, but I am actually, if you, I will, and hopefully Dr. Narlikar will talk more about the European perspective on India, but I will focus mainly on what I do actually do research is India's relation with West Asia and evolving West Asian perceptions of India, which is I think a close geography and might be also interesting for this debate. But I'm happy also talking the Q&A more about European perceptions of Indian foreign policy. And the reason I think it's important to talk about West Asian perceptions or Middle Eastern perceptions is that there's been this discussion, especially over the last decade, about an evolving perception or vision of India in the Middle East, especially the GCC or Israel. And you could place it in maybe, I think it's since 2014 and the BJP coming back to power and the prime ministership of Narendra Modi, but also to the first visit, I think, in UAE of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first Middle Eastern visit. I think that's when you see this evolving perception, and it's been, I mean, judged one of the most successful foreign policy achievement of the Modi government. And you've seen all these strategies over the last few years, whether it's called Think West, Look West, Link West, Act West, Go West, or whatever terminology you want to use. But there's actually been a strategic shift in the perception of the region vis-a-vis India and India's foreign policy, and what could explain this apparent change of the last few years. And I'll talk a little bit, maybe we can expect this to evolve with the perceived US withdrawal from the region, maybe not in substantial terms, but actually perceived, the growing Chinese involvement in the region, the recent Iranian protest, and also changes in Israeli politics. So I think it's important to take a bit of all of that into account. I'm not gonna, we are short in time, so I'm not gonna talk all about the background of India West Asia policy, but what is important to know is there's been a fluctuation of India's engagement in the region, and then evolving perceptions from the different actors in the region about related to India's direct involvement in the region, especially in the 50s all the way to the 80s, where India's material capacities were constrained. It shows, as I think Dr. Rajamon has written in other venues, that it shows not to follow the British-Indian route of direct security, political involvement in the region, and this decided to have a more to engage post-colonial governments and to engage secular Arab governments, which led to take sides and not and to basically not develop relations with some other players, especially in the GCC. And then there's been the issues of energy and transactional involvement also with some of the GCC, mainly economic energy relations, some degree of social relations through the important diaspora in the region. But India had really limited a distance and not directly active involvement. And that changed in the 1990s, some structural changes, opportunities, constraints also, but with the evolving regional politics that I can discuss more in the Q&A if you want, but also growing engagement of India, a direct engagement of multiple actors in the region, the most visible being Israel with the normalization of diplomatic relations, but also engagement of Iran since that it had estranged relations in the late 1970s, but also other actors in the GCC. And I think what's important to explain a little bit the evolution of the perception by actors of India's role in the region is also the perception also within India of India's leadership, at least, of its interest in the regions have evolved to some degree, and also an evolving perception of India's capacities to act on these interests, these evolving interests in the region. Some of them are structural. There's always been the issue of energy. There's been trade relationships that are predate even British India, diaspora and remittance, as I mentioned, and increasingly maybe also foreign direct investments coming from the region, whether Israel and GCC. Those are new evolving factors that are shaping Indian perceptions. But about India's the evolving perception of India. One quickly about the perception of interest from the Indian side. India has always engaged all relevant actors. However, since 2014, I think there's been a more direct recognition from the Modi government, and especially from the foreign policy establishment, of the economic trade diaspora, and especially also increasingly security interest in the region, especially also the Gulf region. So there's been a series of interesting statements, at least in the initial Modi years, about that, you know, India's West Asia policy had been very indirect and evolutionary happening that was kind of relatively autonomous of strategic calculations. That was a direct citation from Dr. Shankar when he was foreign secretary, and basically an argument that the ties were dictated more by markets and social or personal relations than by policy. And there's been increasingly recognition that, you know, to build on the combination of human and energy connectivity over the last decade. So this has led this current government to increase public exchanges, visits, and to institutionalize various partnerships in the region. So there's an evolving interest or recognition, public recognition of certain interests in the region. and also a different perception of capacities. That's at least from the perspective, I think, also coming from the Gulf, that India is shedding a little bit its defensiveness when it's engaging certain regional players in the region, whether it's Israel, the GCC, and that India at least the current leadership does not perceive this domestic politics playing as a constraint as it used to, at least under the Congress governments, for instance. So effectively decoupling domestic politics from bilateral relationship with some of the regional actors in the region. And the diaspora also not perceived as a liability or a problem when engaging some of the GCC or other actors in the Middle East, but increasingly as actually an advantage and something to build on to develop better relations with the Middle Eastern or West Asian actors. And Pakistan no longer playing an obstacle. It's no longer zero sum, that Pakistan relationships with some of the countries in the region will be maintained, will keep happening, but India also can develop its own relationship with some of these actors. So I think this is an evolving proactive policy from India, but it's also been perceived and recognized also by a lot of the actors, shedding a lot of the shibboleth or these inhibitions that existed in the past. So the regional perception of India have changed, and it's also coming from, I think, the Middle Eastern actors, the West Asian actors. There's an increasingly look east policy of the most, I think, relevant, pertinent Middle Eastern actors that are looking towards India and China for the GCC, for instance, for developing, for investing. They have these huge sovereign funds that they want to invest in certain emerging markets. So they're looking increasingly at Southeast Asia, India, China. So there's been this kind of mutual recognition of shared interest or potential cooperation. Israel also looking towards India, China, and other actors for exports and for joint ventures. So there's also within that the more direct recognition of India as an important emerging market for energy exports, but also for foreign investments and joint ventures opportunities of the last few years. There's also been, as I mentioned earlier, this is mostly coming, I mean, it's historically becoming for Israel that thinks it has shared insecurity concerns and interest with India, but increasingly also from the GCC, whether it is maritime security. Obviously, India's more growing involvement in that region and that the GCCs are welcoming on counter-piracy or other issues of maritime security, but also counterterrorism is becoming a joint issue of discussion of the last decade. And this is in maritime security, counterterrorism is becoming especially pertinent in the context of perceived, at least from some of the GCC actors, or potentially also Israel, of a perceived U.S. disengagement in the region, which again is maybe not happening in material terms, but is perceived over the long term for some of the actors in the region. And finally, the GCC, as I mentioned, has been going through a process of de-hyphenation of also India-Pakistan relationship. They'll maintain their traditional historical relationship with Pakistan, but that won't come at the expense of developing better relations with India, because there's a lot of other potential cooperation outcomes that they can think of with India that they can develop, obviously, with Pakistan, so notably for investments. And also, as I mentioned, Israel also sees India as a crucial market for defense. I mean, India is the first market for defense export for Israel, has been now for a little while, but also in agriculture, water management, water technologies, and other series of joint ventures in high technology and other potential domains. So Israel has also looked at India for the last 2 decades, so has welcomed this growing engagement of India in the region. And what you see also from a lot of these actors, and especially from the GCC sides, but also a series of other Middle Eastern Arab states, is limited criticism of the domestic politics, or of the BJP's policies, which could be perceived as affecting the kind of welfare of certain religious minorities. You've seen this during the row last summer, during the Prophet's row with one of some spokesperson for the BJP. There was a series of obviously public statements from the GCC, but that was quickly managed by both sides because there's a perception that there's an interesting cooperative kind of relationship building, and that won't affect these relationships. So there's been also a change within the GCC, engaging with India, that there's actually a more pragmatic, long-term political, economic relationship, and domestic politics on both sides will not affect this. So this is basically, I would argue, to conclude a bit, is that conditions are ripe for long-term change and orthodoxy from both sides in engaging the two regions. They will be still regional divisions in the Middle East, and so evolving perception of what they expect India to take sides, whether it is the Israel-Palestine dispute, Iran and the GCC, other intra-Gulf divides within the GCC itself. But in the old, there's engagement of all actors with India because they feel it's very powerful in the future. And there's all, again, as I mentioned, this long-term underlying issue of the US strategic disengagement and its consequences, and concerns about Iran, especially with the latest protests and the uncertainty of the local politics. And again, increasing involvement of China. A lot of these actors are edging between China and India in the region. So I think
Nicolas,
one last statement.
Nicolas, yeah.
Yep. I mean, I will just one last statement, if you don't mind, Dr. Rajaba, is basically also increasingly linking. I mentioned Luki's policies from the GCC. Increasingly, this connection linked to the previous presentation of the Indo-Pacific also being perceived by a lot of the local actors in the Middle East, and then India plays also a major role in this expanded interpretation of the Indo-Pacific, which also includes parts of the Middle East. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. Yeah. Now we go to Europe. Amrita, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And congratulations to Team ICWA on this timely event. And it's a pleasure for me to be a part of this distinguished panel, chaired by the inimitable Professor Raja Mohan. It's great to see you all. I'll be focusing my remarks, like Nicolas said, on EU and India relations. And I'll do three things right now. I'll first suggest why the European Union and India should be natural allies, a concept that comes out of the Panchatantra. As a second step, I'll show that the EU-India partnership is, at best, a clumsy tango. In the third step, I'll highlight some of the miscalculations that have contributed to the clumsiness of what should be a beautiful dance. So the EU and India should be natural allies. They have been strategic partners since 2004. Both share a deeply held commitment to democracy. Diplomatic niceties and sweet talk of their symmetry besides, there is also an urgent need for the two to deepen their cooperation, given growing assertiveness and expansionism of authoritarian states. So China's global expansion via the Belt and Road Initiative, its military adventurism in Asia, misuse of the multilateral trading system, human rights violations in Xinjiang have been well known in Europe. But all these disturbing trends were perhaps seen as being far away from Europe. So the EU developed a narrative in 2019 that China was Europe's partner, competitor, and rival. And in doing so, I would argue, chose to eat its cake and have it too. Europe did. Today, the EU has greater cause for concern. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought the threat directly to European borders. And despite much speculation, or maybe it's just wishful thinking, on how China is trying to distance itself from Russia, European politicians and technocrats will be well served to remember that China and Russia announced a no-limits partnership in February last year. China is no longer a distant threat to Europe, be this via its large investment projects in infrastructure in Europe or via its partnership with Russia. India also finds itself in a tough spot. For years now, it has experienced China's increasing overreach across multiple issue areas, including military confrontations on its border with casualties. India's concerns about China are serious enough to make India the sole holdout on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and also refrain from joining the BRI. Also, in terms of diversifying its military dependence away from Russia, a Russia that could be increasingly drawn into the arms of China amidst sanctions and other measures from the West, India would be well served to deepen its relationship with Europe. So there are plenty of reasons why the world's largest democracies should be collaborating more closely than ever. And yet, despite the best intentions, shared interests and values, and new imperatives demanding their cooperation, it is the limitations of this partnership that stand out. So I come to the second part of my argument. Witness negotiations over a range of areas, from trade to geopolitics, and the differences between the two players are clear. So negotiations for an EU-India free trade agreement were begun in 2007, but they were put on hold in 2014. It took another 7 years for them to resume in 2021. And for all the goodwill on both sides and attempts to drum up public excitement over this step, these negotiations will still not be a cakewalk. Amongst the difficulties include the EU's labour and environmental standards, which have been quite the bugbear in its trade dealings, not only with India, but also with some other major players in the global south. For example, the difficulties that the EU-Mercosur agreement has run into. Fundamental disagreements between the EU and India also appear on questions of geostrategy and high politics, as exemplified over the positions that the two have adopted over Russia and Ukraine. So you'll remember that the EU had urged India to take a firm line condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. India chose its own path. But in doing so at the UNGA, at the General Assembly, India again ended up in an odd corner of abstaining parties, together with China and Pakistan. There is, as my German friends like to say, Luft nach oben, room for improvement in the EU-India relationship. So now I come to the third and final part of my argument. A little bit of explanation. For the unfulfilled potential of their partnership, both the EU and India share some responsibility. In keeping with my assigned task today, I will focus right now on the EU, but I would also be happy to talk about India later on in Q&A. So in terms of miscalculations by the EU, 3 points are important. First, the EU tends to place considerable emphasis on business relations with India. And this is an issue that India too is interested in promoting, especially under the business-oriented Modi government that has prioritized growth and development. But then the EU swiftly goes down a cul-de-sac of the narrowly defined values of social and environmental standards whenever trade agreements are discussed, whenever business is discussed. And the tone of these discussions can come across as if the Europeans are preaching to their Indian counterparts, ignoring the many proud traditions of liberalism that India actually owns. And neither the content nor the tone of these discussions are useful for winning trust when negotiating with an ancient civilization like India. The second problem. If one compares this with the EU's negotiation strategy with China, it is very difficult to avoid accusations of hypocrisy and double standards. So China's flagrant human rights violations in Xinjiang have produced little more than some finger wagging in Europe thus far. But business continues, Business continues as usual. And this is especially the case even in the country where I'm sitting right now, Germany. And I can talk more about Germany as well in Q&A if people are interested. Now, these double standards, I must say, are also evident in media reporting and punditry in much of Europe. So Indian democracy is frequently scrutinized and lambasted, severely criticized, while a blind eye is turned to China's domestic, regional, and global excesses. And the third problem, even as Europe is slowly waking up to the dangers posed by China to the existing global order, the call for more China-specific research expertise is growing. Unfortunately, though, this is not matched by a demand for more in-depth knowledge on India or other actors in Asia. And to some extent, this is understandable. We all tend to focus on the problems and take the rest for granted. But this skewed focus means that there is far too little expertise on India in Europe, and public interest does not go much beyond the usual cliches. So opportunities to harness the full potential of EU-India relations remain untapped amidst this rather special mix of judgmentalism and limited interest. I'll stop there. Raja, you're still muted.
Yeah, just saying thank you, Amrita, for that sharp and presentation on EU. So we now move on to the US. Michael, the floor is yours. 10 minutes, and then we'll have some time left for Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This is such a timely event, and it's an honor to be a part of it. I'm also sorry for being a few minutes late. Really enjoyed hearing those presentations. I've been asked to offer briefly a U.S. perspective on the evolution of India's foreign policy. So I'll briefly offer some thoughts on what stands out about that evolution seen through a U.S. lens. For me, three words come to mind when thinking about India's track record on foreign policy over the last 75 years, and especially over the last 30 years, when it has become an increasingly bigger player on the global stage and the US-India relationship began to really shape into form, so to speak. All three words begin with a B, so I'll describe these as the three Bs. The first word would be balancer. I mean, for me, one of India's major foreign policy achievements has been its ability to balance relationships with different sets of nations that oftentimes are rivals. This is in many ways, I presume, the essence of strategic autonomy, the ability to maintain foreign policy agency by pursuing relations with a range of countries, no matter where their allegiances lie or no matter what camp they might be a part of. And clearly the most obvious recent example is how India has continued to balance its relations with the US and Russia over the last year. A great indicator of success is that today, India's relations with neither Washington nor Moscow have suffered, and both capitals have essentially accepted that New Delhi's policies are not about to change, even in light of the events of the last year. But we can also look to similar success stories of India balancing relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also with the Israelis and Palestinians to a degree. Now, of course, the main exception to this balancing policy might appear to be US-China competition. India is clearly working with the United States very actively to counterbalance China. But even here, there is still some balancing at play. New Delhi prefers, as I understand it, that the US limit its public expressions of support for India during India-China border crises to avoid provoking China further. And India, of course, continues to stay out of the US-led alliance system, even though it's really strengthened relations with the US, particularly on security levels and strategic levels, for a number of years now. And meanwhile, India has continued to pursue robust commercial relations with China, even after the Galwan clash several years back. India-China trade crossed the 100 billion mark for the first time during the last fiscal year. It wasn't always this way. Non-alignment and strategic autonomy may be about a balancing, but it didn't always work out that way. Going back, especially to the early post-colonial period, the non-aligned movement was meant to signify an unwillingness to join any one camp, but the non-aligned movement was in itself a camp. Then, of course, during the Cold War, when India concluded its friendship treaty with the Soviet Union in the early 1970s, that really closed off a lot of possibilities for cooperation on substantive levels with the US for the next few decades. And it prevented New Delhi from building on earlier momentum in US-India relations when President Eisenhower made a milestone visit to India in 1959, and then when President Kennedy backed India in its war against China several years later. India was impacted deleteriously by great power rivalry at that time. The US in the late 1950s and in the early 1960s and much of the 1960s was drawn to the idea of partnership with India because it shared India's concerns about China, which of course sounds familiar given how things played out in more recent years. But then by the early 1970s, with the US wanting to work toward formalizing relations with China, Washington turned to Islamabad for assistance, and that really doomed US-India relations for several decades. It didn't doom them, but it made it more difficult to pursue US-India relations during those last few decades of the Cold War. India was more or less, maybe not in the Soviet camp, but that friendship treaty with the Soviets from a US perspective made it seem like it was pretty close to being in the Soviet camp until the end of the Cold War. And of course, this is very different from today, with India, at least to this point, able to rise above the fray of this great power churn we're seeing playing out in the world, and it's been able to manage its relations with those rival powers and competitors. The second B, the B word I like to talk about is bridge. Over the last 75 years, and especially over the last 30 years, when India's global power, global prominence began to take greater shape, New Delhi sought to serve as a bridge between the world's two broadest geopolitical blocks, the developing and the developed worlds, or the global south and the global north. Decades ago, India was deeply anchored in the global south as a leader of the non-aligned movement, which was often at odds with the global north. But as it began developing deeper ties with the West, and other wealthy countries over the last 30 years, as its own economic growth began to take shape, and as it became more deeply anchored in the institutional architecture of the developed world, from the G20 to the more recent AIIB, and of course the Quad and Indo-Pacific frameworks, it's taken on a greater ability to move between both worlds, so to speak. And it's found itself in a better position to work within developed world contexts to better advocate on behalf of the developing world. And this, of course, is one of its big goals with its G20 presidency this year. Work within the G20 to push for measures that ease challenges that hit the developing world especially hard: debt, poverty, climate change, and the like. And India has sought to use other groupings where it's a member, like the BRICS grouping, to play this role. But the G20 has really given it a really great opportunity, since the G20 has the most economically powerful countries in the world. The third B word I'll describe is bipartisanship, which, admittedly, it's a term one doesn't hear much at all these days in our very polarized and divided world. I say bipartisanship from the perspective of the outside world, beyond India. India has evolved from a country that struggled to develop deep partnerships with many key capitals around the world to a country that today enjoys deep partnerships around the world with many key capitals, where there is full bipartisan, or should I say multi-partisan, multi-stakeholder support for such deep partnerships. There's a strong multi-partisan consensus, a consensus among different political stakeholders in many countries, barring a few notable exceptions, that India should be viewed as a strategic player, and especially as a key market and trade partner. And this entails good relations. It's a relatively new phenomenon. Remember that the event that's often described as a turning point in US-India relations, when Washington truly began to see New Delhi as a strategic partner, was the civil nuclear deal. But there were very vocal political opponents to that deal in India, for sure, but also in the US. For example, non-proliferation hawks were quite against the deal in Washington. Only over the last decade or so, with India's economic growth truly having taken off, and for many countries in the West, with competition with China having really taken off, only then have we started to see this more multi-partisan support for good relations with India really set in. Even a great share of the countries that value their commercial cooperation with China demonstrate multi-partisan support for the idea of robust engagement with India. And the example I like to cite to show proof of this strong multi-partisan support for U.S.-India partnership in the U.S. is this. During the Trump administration, and I'll conclude here, during the Trump administration, just about all the U.S. foreign policy sure things, so to speak, were essentially turned on their heads. U.S. relations with many, if not many, U.S. relations with many, if not most, of America's top allies in Europe and Asia took some big hits. The U.S. began flirting with North Korea and Russia. But through all that tumult and changes, drastic changes in foreign policy, U.S. relations with India really picked up where they had left off in the Obama, Bush, and Clinton administrations. They got stronger. Yes, there were trade tensions, there were other problems, but that wasn't that new. So even a president as iconoclastic and so different in thinking as Trump wanted to keep the relationship moving with India. In fact, during that Trump era, the U.S. relations with India was probably one of the most. It was one of the rare areas of foreign policy where you did not have disruptions or threats. The U.S. relationship with Israel may be another example, but my point is that really over the last few years, for the last decade especially, we've seen this change in so many key capitals around the world. The U.S. for sure, but others as well, in favor of a strong relationship with India, a view that transcends different political parties and political perspectives. So I'll wrap up there. Look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for those 3 Bs. I think it's really the 4 presentations have really justified. I mean, the idea of having this session of taking a look at India from outside, from 4 geographies, from East Asia, from the Middle East, from Europe, and from the United States. So we got about 15 more minutes. So I'll reserve my comments till the end. So maybe we can take some questions now. So maybe we can take a few at a time and then go back to the panel. I see some questions have already come in. So just give me a minute to, is there someone who can help me with this from ICWA, or should I just read these questions?
Should I read the questions?
Yeah, why don't you? There are 2, 3 already, right?
Yeah, the first questions and most of the questions is to Professor Narlikar. First question, after the invasion of Ukraine, German Chancellor decided to increase the defense funding. What is your reading on a possibility of a Germany-India partnership on this front? Can India private and public defense industry cooperate and coordinate with their German counterparts and jointly work in research and development, etc.? This may also aid India's defense diversification drive. There's another question again to Professor Amrita. Why France has been more ahead of other EU powers in recognizing China as a security threat? Some comparison between Germany and France in this regard. And one more question, in what way you can get over the misconceptions and misunderstandings with regard to India to improve relations? All these questions are to Professor Narlikar.
Amrita, the floor is yours. Maybe Mike, others can jump in. Probably Nicolas can jump in if you can chip in on terms of most questions are related to Europe. Yeah, Amrita, just jump in.
Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions. Let me start with the last one first. And how can the EU get over these misconceptions and misunderstandings? Right? I think sort of there are several ways, but to me the most important one is, and this is in a way different from the way the Biden administration is handling India, right? And it has to do with values. And what the EU seems to do is it loves to talk about value-oriented diplomacy, but it's a very narrow understanding of values, right? And that sort of almost always goes down that cul-de-sac of labor standards and environmental standards. It's not about democracy. It's not about pluralism. And when liberal values are talked about, it's almost always liberalism, we are the guardians of liberalism. Let us explain to you how this works, India. Right. And that just, and India does have powerful traditions, for example, of pluralism that go back to ancient times. Right. So the EU, despite all the sweet talk, does not actually look at India eye to eye. And I think it's interesting how in the case of the US, there is more willingness to engage with India as a democracy. India, too, can help shape this. right? And so India's reaction to this, this sort of EU talk and where we know all about values, you don't, and you're all Asia. Now you're all Asia. And there's so much difference between how China looks at the world and India looks at the world versus Vietnam versus Malaysia, et cetera, right? So it's not that we all in Asia have one shared understanding of values or democracy or human rights or pluralism and so on and so forth. India's reaction to this is often to say, yeah, we're going to be pragmatic, we're going to be interest-based. And I think that's a lost opportunity because India can claim this discussion. India has a lot of soft power that it should claim, right? And and those two things are reflexive. Values and interests are reflexive. So I would say India should claim this more, own it more. And the EU should also look at India more eye to eye, which needs more research, more understanding, more engagement. Now it's all China, 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 right? And there's very little happening on India. So that would be an important step towards this. The second question on Ukraine and the Zeitenwende, yeah, I mean, that is everybody talked about a Zeitenwende in Germany, an epochal shift, right, with a willingness to spend more on defense and to do more. And then you see the reluctance in actually sending weapons to Ukraine, right? So there was a lot of excitement at the time. Let's see how this develops. In the Indian case, to me, it's clear that I talked about soft power, but soft power will not be enough. Now there needs to be a lot more hard cooperation on, yes, military, in the military arena and on dual use technology, on the digital sector, on cybersecurity, and India's dependence on Russia needs to decrease in terms of defense capability, especially with China next door, right? Will Germany do this? They should do this, but Germany finds it very difficult to do anything on defense cooperation, right? So I would say we should keep pushing for it, but also India's nuclear status. So as soon as you say defense, I mean, the German technocrats and politicians start closing up. And on the maybe Nicolas would like to answer the question on France versus Germany.
I think we now have a lot of questions rolling in, so I think if you can keep your answers brief, then we can address all of them. Yeah.
I mean, on France and Germany vis-a-vis India, I think one of them is, I mean, France, there's a couple of different factors. I mean, Germany has developed, there's a lot of good literature on this, developed since the 90s, a very strong commercial relationship with China. So there's a lot of economic interest, a lot of also, which are also linked to political interest, which explains a lot of domestic politics, domestic economic policies can explain the reluctance from Germany's side to completely side or to define as more than a systemic rival or in the jargon that's used at the EU level or that France is used. And France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. Has also felt growing Chinese influence in that region. There's also some conflict in soft power kind of rivalry in Africa. So France has felt Chinese influence coming in a zero-sum way with its own interests. So I think there's been some more direct conflict of interest that can explain this evolution on the Indo-Pacific strategy and defining China in more adverse terms than Germany. So I think there's a series of these factors that diverge for both actors, and why you see some disagreements happening to define China in the more general aggregate EU policy.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you read out the number of 4 or 5 questions quickly, and then we'll go to the whole panel, and then I think there are questions for everyone in this one. Could you read them, please?
Yeah, there are questions again. Let me just read out 2 questions which are directed to Michael. These are one question: with comeback of TTP, Pakistan's state-sponsored terrorism policy has run out of its course. How is this Pakistan TTP Taliban dynamic going to impact India and US relations? Then one more question to Dr. Jung, the security implication of North Korea's departure from the self-declared moratorium on missile testing is an issue of concern. How do you see the role of China implications for the Korean Peninsula? And again, one more question to Dr. Jung here. How can we look India as a leading nation, thereby balancing external powers such as US, Japan in the Indo-Pacific region? Also, how can India, through its necklace diamond strategy, can act as a relative gainer into the Indo-Pacific region with reference to China? So these are questions now I've just picked up, and if we can have the response, then we can go further.
I think why don't you read all of them, then we'll just go to all of them together.
Okay, fine. The next question is, it's not directed to anyone. It is like India-EU relations are mainly business-driven and less strategic. Is it because the EU does not have the capacity to be a key player in the Indo-Pacific region? Then another question to Dr. Jung. Can you please share your views on how ROK views China through the new Indo-Pacific strategy, especially as the strategy document mentions China as a key partner for achieving prosperity and peace in the Indo-Pacific region? There's another question, how India balances, this is to the whole panel, how India balances regional and geographical interests and conflicts with international and institutional interests and conflicts using strategic autonomy, or how India can address some existing conflicts between regional interest and the position it seeks in international arena. Next question again to Dr. Jung regarding South Korea's new approach of increasing closeness with Japan under President Yeon. How do you see the prospect of ROK-Japan relations in the near and long-term future?
Yeah, I think this is more than enough. I think we will.
There are a couple of other questions
no,
also.
I think let's close it here because we just
yeah, because there's so many questions.
4 minutes left.
Yeah.
So I think we'll start with Dr. Chi. You want to start? You want to answer your questions? I'll just go in the sequence we had. And any other comments you want to make so that we can wrap this up in time?
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. And I don't think that I will be able to answer all the questions, but I will start to
Speak
answer.
up a bit, please. Yeah.
Yes, from the last question. So currently, President Yoon is trying to make cordial relations with Japan. So several official and unofficial dialogues has been convened between two countries, and it is very much premature to make any conclusion how a bilateral relationship will be resumed between the two countries. But many expects that probably but at least the ROK-Japan relations will be improved than under the last previous government. And the second question I'd like to answer that about the North Korea issue and the role of China. So recent trend has been made in East Asia. There is a refreshed arms race, in fact. So every country in East Asia, that includes North, South Korea, Japan, and China, they are encouraged very much from each other to develop the advanced space technology, and North Korea is linking its issue to its ICBMs. So it is likely that North Korea will test its ICBMs and the other types of the missiles more in the future. And it is unknown that how China will support for the North Korea's military technology development. But it is for sure there is a common understanding in East Asia that at least China will back up North Korea not to be collapsed. So that may be the minimum line to understand. And I'd like to wrap up here. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicolas, you want to say something? Or any final thoughts in a responses here? Then we'll move on.
I don't think there was any specific question. I mean, there's one very broad to the entire about balancing regional and geographical interests and conflicts with the interest. I think that could be an entire panel, if not more. It is true that this strategic autonomy argument, often used to explain India's position as pragmatic, as often there's an ideological stance that's behind it or is promoted as such, and sometimes it's presented in a pragmatic way, depending on the situation and the context and the audience by the Indian foreign policy establishment, or it's the bureaucrats at least. And again, that's where that. So sometimes you see these conflicting positions, but again, that's something that's can be attributed to any major power that has to take a position on any potential conflict or regional disputes. So I think you will see these contradictions, and we'll have to see how India manages to rationalize it through this strategic autonomy framework. Yeah.
Thank you. Amrita.
Very briefly, to pick up on the point and add to what Nicolas said on France versus Germany in relation to India. In Germany, you see a siloization of strategy. So you have the economic ministries and business interests doing one thing, and deep concern on security questions coming, for example, from the foreign ministry. But there isn't a grand strategy. And the absence of that grand strategy makes it very difficult to recognize geoeconomic threats of weaponized interdependence. France seems to do grand strategy better, just like France seems to do everything grand better. Thanks.
Michael, you had a couple of questions, so why don't you, and any other thoughts so that we can wrap this up?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be very brief. There was a question about the Afghanistan-Pakistan situation and what Pakistan's concerns about the TTP and its relations with the Taliban, what that could mean for India and the US-India relationship. I believe that was the question. I imagine, though I really would defer to those in New Delhi, but I imagine that as reports continue to intensify about the potential for a new Pakistani counterterrorism offensive against the TTP, I imagine that this could raise some concerns in India about the prospects for a revitalized U.S.-Pakistan security relationship. I don't think that's going to happen. And there's been a lot of Pakistani media reports suggesting that the U.S. is planning to provide assistance to Pakistan in a counterterrorism offensive. I don't really think that's true at all. I mean, the U.S. has really moved on from that region. Obviously, it has no more troops in Afghanistan. It's not really keeping as sharp of an eye on the Afghanistan-Pakistan region as it had 5, 10, 15 years ago. U.S. security assistance to Pakistan remains frozen, and there are a number of conditionalities in the new U.S. spending bill when it comes to potential spending going to Pakistan. So I would not overstate that notion of the possibility of the U.S. and Pakistan resuming security cooperation. I just don't see that happening. I do think that just from the perspective of India's interests, if Pakistan were to launch an offensive, a cross-border offensive that aims to target TTP bases in Afghanistan, that obviously would raise the levels of instability in Afghanistan, as you know, the Taliban, the TTP, Islamic State, and others would be very unhappy about that type of Pakistani operation. And for India, which of course has somewhat reopened its embassy in Kabul, is trying to quietly operate there under some pretty significant concerns about security. I think that could be problematic for India, given that the very volatile security situation in Afghanistan could intensify. And then there was one more question, very briefly, about the Quad, if it makes any assurances toward helping strengthen or enhance India's geopolitical security. The Quad, as I understand it, is meant to be a balancing forum. A counterbalancing forum. It's meant to counterbalance China's power. Its security, its scope is security focused because it intends to strengthen security relations between the 4 Quad countries. But it's not an alliance. It's not a bloc. And some of the initial initiatives of the Quad have been non-security focused, such as this plan to deliver COVID vaccines across East Asia and Southeast Asia, obviously to push back against what China has been able to do in that regard. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm afraid we had to close this at this point because just when we got going, like always it happens, I think we're beginning to get into warming up the discussion. But time is a constraint. It's a dinner time in India, as you know, that we're not going to hold back participants here for too long. And I won't try to summarize the discussion, but I thought it was really interesting. Maybe 4 basic points. I mean, in East Asia, it's the key seems to be how close will India and US will get together. Because China is betting that India will remain non-aligned. Japan is despair that India is stuck with strategic autonomy. And Korea is, of course, somewhat disinterested. So it's really the key, given the sharpening tensions between US and China. I think the nature of the US-India relationship will be the key to shaping, I think, what the Indian role in that region will begin to emerge. I think on the Middle East, we've seen really so much change that has taken place. Nicolas has captured most of it. But one point, the so-called I2U2, that is India, Israel, US, UAE relationship, I think captures all the change. 3 countries that we tried to keep reasonable distance from through the last 7 decades. That is, we didn't want to be seen with the Americans, didn't want to be seen with the Israelis, didn't want to be seen with the Gulf sheikhs. But the 3 of them are our best friends in the Gulf today, in the Middle East. So the I2U2, in a way, captures the fundamental change, the way India is dealing with this region. And here, I would say, really, the emergence of the Gulf as a major source of capital. I think in India, we're not paying enough attention. We're still looking at it in the old eyes of the Middle East. But the Gulf capital, or what they call the Khaliji capital, is extraordinarily weighty, and India is just barely scratching the surface to exploit the Gulf capital for its own development and for its own transformation. On Europe, I mean, I think Amrita captured it. I mean, the Europe's miscalculations. What for me, the takeaway is India needs to do more. Because the rest of the world, we got to deal with the world as it is, and with all its hypocrisies and realities. But what it comes out quite clearly on the European hypocrisy, which you mentioned, money matters. That is, if you have a good business relationship, Europeans are not so ideological that they'll sacrifice money for the sake of values. So I think the lesson for us is be pragmatic, show them the money, and we can move the relationship in many ways. And finally, with the US, it's really the biggest transformation that has taken place in India's engagement. And I think the 3 Bs, which Michael talked about, as India as a balancer between different powers, India as a bridge between the North and South, and the growing support for India's engagement with India in most major powers, I think captures some of the big things. I think I would just add that it is really the US factor is the one, I think, that has really facilitated, I mean, India's deeper engagement with the Pacific or with East Asia, and the US partnership would also help India in the Middle East and in Europe as well. That actually US being on India's side makes a huge difference to US allies, how much they might be contesting on other issues with the United States. And I think that's really provided a much wider ambit for India's relationship. But I would, in the end, I think it is what India does, and many of the traditional, paradigms which we saw India. I for one believe that strategic autonomy and non-alignment don't really explain what India is doing, and I think we need to pay more attention to that and not just get stuck in those paradigms to understand. I would say start from the facts rather than start with non-alignment and strategic autonomy. Then I think it'll lead us to a very, very different place in terms of where India is headed. I would go with Amrita on this. India is not alien to Panchatantra or Kautilya, that the real politic today, I think, is beginning to dominate India's approach. While it looks like many of the traditional tropes are still there, within that, a rising India, I think, is changing the way it deals with the world, and I think that is a huge change that is unfolding. But I would recommend to the Director General, ICW Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, who is here, that I think this is a good session. I think we need to do, we could do more of this, having outsiders look at us and ask different countries, different people, to give a frank assessment of how they look at India and India's role. For example, Dr. Chi's presentation was quite clear. I mean, how nuanced and differentiated it was, how the three Northeast Asian countries look at us. So I think having more of that, I think will enrich India's own debate about its foreign policy. So I would say it's worth doing a full seminar, I think, of how others look at us. Because as I said at the beginning, we tend to be too self-absorbed and self-referential. Having others point out how they look at us, I think would really enrich our own discourse. So I'll stop here. I want to thank the Director General and the ICWA for organizing this session. And please join me in thanking the four panelists who really been very scintillating, very sharp, and very pointed in their presentation. So thank you. Please, let's give them a hand. I don't know how you do it on this. I think there is a sign somewhere. Let's do that. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for chairing the session. I will also thank Professor G, Professor Blarel, Professor Narlikar, and Mr. Kugelman for joining in from the various corners of the world and sharing your views and experiences. With this, we come to the end of the first day of our seminar. We will be starting our fifth session tomorrow at 12 hours, Indian Standard Time. I wish you all a very good day and a very good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.